Hi, my name is Jessie Nugiel, and I'm here to compare what a pre-World War II versus post-World War II animated film was like in Japan. But first, we have to define what time era a pre-World War II versus post-World War II film would be considered. So if World War II took place from 1939 to 1945, then a pre-World War II era film would be considered somewhere from between the 30s to 50s, while a post-World War II film would be considered from being made through the 60s up into contemporary time, because as we see as the decades pass, there's less criticism of Japanese politics and the government. For the pre-World War II section of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on two films, that being Momotaro and the Sacred Sailors and Evil Mickey Mouse. These two movies are what are essentially the last of the Japanese propaganda films that were produced during the final years of the Empire of Japan before they decided to purge all Japanese propaganda media pieces. These two films were actually only resurfaced and rediscovered until 1983. So for quite a while, it seemed as if all Japanese propaganda pieces were lost to the test of time. But I digress, we have them now. They've thus been uncovered, so we, the public, can analyze them and see what Japanese animation was like during this time and what they were trying to communicate. Now, these two films are actually quite similar in terms of what they were trying to do upon consummation of them, that being to appeal to Japan's politics and their agenda / the Axis powers, or simply just demonize the West through stereotypes of them, much in contrast to how Disney and American cartoons would depict racial stereotypes and characters of Japanese people in their own films and shows. This is incredibly apparent in Evil Mickey Mouse, it's in the name, whilst in Momotaro and the Sacred Sailor, they show the horrors of US occupation in Japan, a reflection for what had happened in Japanese prefectures at the time, such as what happened in Okinawa. However, it's more so the marketing and production of these films that make it more egregious than what their narrative was actually trying to communicate, aside from its wartime position and what it actually meant to Japanese folk. These films are obviously marketed towards pro-war groups in Japan, but were also marketed towards children, forcibly putting these notions of division, nationalism, and pro-war in their susceptible minds, and unfortunately, anyone who criticized this was criminally prosecuted. Now, this could have been incredibly dangerous had the Empire of Japan not disbanded, as the international community would have seen high levels of supremacy within the Japanese youth. That is until Osamu Tezuka made Astro Boy. Our seemingly hero, Osamu Tezuka, is commonly referred to as the father of anime, as he's the one that pointedly popularized anime and manga with his releases such as Astro Boy, Unico, Kimba the White Lion, and even the establishment of the company Toei Animation, which some have even gone as far to call the quote-unquote Disney of the East. However, Osamu Tezuka is more than just the father of anime, but he also fostered an entire new genre of Japanese animation, that being anti-war. In his own filmography and original works, Osamu Tezuka tries to convey the theme of peace amongst the masses, or rather, the opposite of the division that Japanese propaganda films were trying to advocate for. In Unico, for example, a major arc follows the interracial friendship between two children, despite their communities being at war, with the climax of it being a resolution / peace treaty between the two groups. And although the power of friendship trope can be seen as cheesy to a handful of viewers, I think it was incredibly important for Japanese children to see this at this time after so much hate was funneled down their throats upon seeing Japanese propaganda pieces. That being said, following Tezuka's releases were major cinematic hits such as Barefoot Gen, Grave of the Fireflies, and Neon Genesis Evangelion. Now, all three of these were critically considered to be Japanese responses to World War II, as they showed pretty graphic depictions and at times hard-to-stomach presentations of how the atomic bombs, generational division, and corrupt government uprooted the lives of most Japanese citizens. However, for the post-World War II film section of this presentation, I mainly want to focus on Akira and In This Corner of the World, because not only do I believe they are the best in communicating the aforementioned ideas, but I also think they're the most important films in terms of sympathizing with the Japanese citizens while simultaneously critiquing the Empire of Japan in World War II. Akira does this through its dichotomy of both hopelessness and effect of World War II, but also celebrating its end. The society in which Akira takes place, that being Neo-Tokyo, is quite literally born from the aftershock trauma and collective memory of Japanese people in wake of World War II. I mean, the opening sequence of the movie is quite literally a big white flash while old Tokyo is obliterated into nothing but ruins. As the viewer watches the events of the movie, we come to notice that there's a lack of parental and authority figures throughout. This is a call to how many children lost their family and parents to World War II, leaving many adolescents and just the younger people in general to navigate life without a guide, thus mindlessly leading to social isolation and boiling nihilism. But at the same time, Akira marks this as the gateway to self-identity through our supposed villain, Tetsuo. Without a higher authority, the Japanese now have the unique power to do whatever they want, i.e. they are no longer pressured by the Japanese government or war. So essentially, Akira is more so a homage to the Japanese collective persevering over Japan's bloody past. Now, on the other hand, we have In This Corner of the World, which is the most recent of all the films listed. And my favorite. The movie was originally released in 2016, just 4 years ago, but despite this, it's perhaps the most brutal criticism and upsetting outlook on the events of Japan during World War II and its impact on the lives of Japanese citizens. Ironically, the film doesn't really have a plot. It more so reads as a biographical outlook on the everyday person's life in Japan during World War II. That's it. There's no major conflict or villain, it's just our main character Suzu living her life day by day. But that's what makes this film devastating. It encapsulates a fear that's not as descriptive as the fears in the rest of the movie. For example, in Akira, Barefoot Gen, and Grave of the Fireflies, we see body horror, mutilation, and just like grotesque images of World War II and its bombings. In Neon Genesis and Akira Again, we see explicit depictions of social isolation and depression. And these are all poignant things that we want to avoid during war. We just want to be happy, we don't want to die, and we don't want to be alone. But In This Corner of the World calls out our deep-seated and probably most unspoken true fear, that being the disruption of the comfortability and pattern of our daily lives. Suzu is a hobbyist artist and struggling to love the man she's been put into an arranged marriage with and laboriously trying to get along with her family. However, just when things are starting to look up for Suzu, the town in which her own family lives in falls victim to one of the atomic bombs. Suzu narrowly misses this by going on a walk around town with her niece. And then a US air raid happens on this same town. Her niece precedingly gets blown up, while Suzu's drawing arm gets blown off. And when Suzu awakes from this horrible thing, she's back at square one with her family. They hate her again, and now the surrounding village has to deal with the loss of food and infrastructural destruction. Now, you don't actually see any blood or gore of this event. All you see is something a lot more emotional, that being the perspective of events being drawn by Suzu. It's incredibly hard to watch, and I actually had to turn off the film at some points. And by the time the credits rolled around with tears streaming down my face, I could only think of one thing, that being, by golly, I wish that hadn't happened. And I think that's exactly what the film's trying to communicate, because regardless of your political stance on the atomic bombings, that's the difference between pre- and post-World War II films. Post-World War II films stand as a testament for something to hopefully never happen again, while pre-World War II films advocated for violence and remained ignorant to what was actually happening to their own citizens.